All right, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Trinidad Rico, who is going to open our conference with, I'm sure, fascinating and engaging discussion in her talk. Dr. Trinidad Rico is Associate Professor and Director of Cultural Heritage and Preservation Studies at Rutgers University. She holds a BA in Archaeology from the University of Cambridge, an MA in Conservation from University College London, and a PhD in Anthropology from Stanford University. Her research has explored the rise of cultures of heritage in post-colonial contexts such as Indonesia and Qatar. Her latest book is The Heritage State: Religion and Preservation in Contemporary Qatar. A copy of her book is on the front desk if you would like to look at it after her talk. Please welcome Dr. Rico.
All right, thanks so much, Maya, Sarah, team, Robert, Ahmed, people I met 5 minutes ago. Thank you for being here. Thank you for those of you who are joining online today. In December 2001, specialists in Muslim law and religion convened in Doha, Qatar, for the Doha Symposium of Ulama on Cultural Heritage, chaired by His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, then Emir of the State of Qatar. Through the involvement of Muslim scholars, the meeting was organized to formulate the point of view of Islam regarding the preservation of cultural heritage. Earlier that year, in February 2001, the Taliban leadership in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan had successfully and theatrically destroyed the 6th and 7th century Buddhist statues at the Valley of Bamyan. Despite international and institutional outcry in the weeks preceding this event, the leader of the Taliban issued a religious edict that condemned non-Islamic statues and sanctuaries across Afghanistan, arguing that the ulama, quote, had not advanced any convincing religious arguments to prevent the destruction of the statues. Against this backdrop, attendees to the Doha Symposium drafted the Doha Statement, a consequential document laying out principles for preserving cultural heritage. The foreword of the statement declared that Muslims can neither approve nor sanction the intentional destruction of any part of human heritage. It also called for strengthening the Muslim religion's tolerance of free and non-Islamic heritage. The recommendations contained in the Doha Statement are unique. They join other advisory documents on matters of cultural protection and understanding. You may have to mute that. Sorry. Protection and understanding under the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, known as UNESCO. Contrary to widely circulated documents such as the Hague Convention of 1954, which sets the standards for safeguarding cultural heritage during wartime, the Doha Statement is a lesser known but significant collaboration between UNESCO and key regional organizations that represent the vast majority of the Muslim world, the OIC, ICESCO, and Alexo. Until then, representation of Muslim voices in terms of expertise and authority in heritage had been very limited in the history of UNESCO's culture sector. For example, in his forthcoming book, my colleague Aliasgar Madraswala examines earlier attempts at governing the conservation of Islamic architectural heritage. One of these is the Lahore Principles of 1980, a document that he argues was more concerned with making the Venice Charter applicable to the Islamic world than with engaging with religious values and traditions meaningfully. And for those of you not centrally in this field, the Venice Charter is almost exclusively concerned with aesthetic and historic values and how these determine originality and authenticity. And this is done at the expense of any other values, for example, sacred values or even other social values. Madraswala also examines another doctrinal document, the Cairo Declaration of 2002, which compiles some of the issues and principles from international charters that, as Brita Rudolph argues, it is not easily applicable to sacred heritage. And to the right, I'm just plugging in Brita Rudolph's 2010 book, which was for the longest time the only thing you could find in the English literature, therefore in the dominant literature of heritage studies, dealing with faith in global Western heritage debates and practices. So it's worth a read. The fact is that heritage traditions and religious traditions have not been easily reconciled, not just for Islam, but for religion in general. On the one hand, we know that religious landscapes and objects have been a key feature of the rise and establishment of global heritage and preservation. Damage to religious structures, in fact, such as the Coventry Cathedral on the left, victim of the November 1940 Blitz during the Second World War, inspired UNESCO's heritage safeguarding mission. So there is, UNESCO could say, yes, we do pay attention to religious buildings. Another structure representing a religious tradition that is iconic for UNESCO's mission is the pharaonic temple complex to Ramses II at Abu Sulayman in Egypt. Clearly, religious traditions have been heritagized quite easily under certain conditions. Things get more complicated when it comes to living religious heritage with active religious stewardship. Most notably, President Erdogan's announcement of the conversion of Hagia Sophia from a museum to an active mosque, and the institutional and global reaction, I think we should call it outcries, over this transformation, demonstrates the conflicts between heritage management and religious stewardship and tells us a little bit about a hierarchy that's embedded in there tacitly or openly. This conflict, which started in the late 19th century for Hagia Sophia, is central to UNESCO's engagement with religious authority. And we can talk more about this later on why this has such a long history and how much I think that may have influenced the way UNESCO shaped itself. The early years of UNESCO's work reveals the extent to which secularism was the preferred doctrine for the advancement of universal heritage value. As early as 1945, the nascent UNESCO was confronted with the challenge of accommodating religious orientations within these universalizing aspirations. Important for our discussions this week, today and tomorrow, I guess, a 1945 letter to the President of the Commission, of the Preparatory Commission of UNESCO, from the head of the Iraqi delegation, calls attention to the lack of members from Arab-speaking countries in the formation of the new executive committee for the organization, despite the eligibility of 5 delegations that were present at the time. He writes that none of these states was elected to represent the views and hopes of the Muslim world in the deliberations of the executive committee would naturally impede the effective cooperation between the Middle Eastern states and the European and the American nations represented in UNESCO, a condition which is not in harmony with the spirit of universal cooperation. Soon after, UNESCO's indirect response during this formative year was found in the declaration that UNESCO cannot base its outlook on one of the competing religions of the world as against the other. The general philosophy of UNESCO should, it seems, be a scientific world humanism, global in extent, and evolutionary in background. And I note, when I expand more on this in my book, that Dr. Al-Assil was not asking for a religious organization in any shape or form, but one that was attentive to the viewpoints of a significantly large portion of the world. So it's quite interesting that this was taken as meaning we need more religion in UNESCO. In the young intergovernmental organization whose original motto was peace in the minds of man, religion was framed as a potentially contentious truth pitted against rational truth, and as such, one of the contributing factors to the disruption of peace. Its growth was influenced by a leadership that recognized the existence and value of religious traditions for humankind, but restricted religious ways of seeing and being in the efforts to define new paradigms for culture, education, and science, as it sought to institutionalize cultural heritage standards across the globe. The first Director General of UNESCO, Julian Huxley, was a known member of the Rationalist Press Association, whose members considered religion to be the main threat posed to society. The result of this type of influence was a mandate that proposed the pursuit of objective truth to circumvent divisive traditions and practices. The favorite philosophy for the organization, scientific world humanism, would have irreparable effects on modern global heritage preservation, especially in the context of profoundly religious societies. Perhaps it is not surprising that during the early decades of heritage internationalism, representation of stewardship from Muslim-majority countries in the work of UNESCO was weak and highly circumscribed, marked by tense relations between UNESCO and the Arab states region in particular, the countries that were often advocating for Muslim representation. Some of these tensions were driven by the persistence of colonial and neo-colonial policies by states whose representatives held powerful sway in international governance institutions. For example, Resolution 181, the UN Partition Plan for Palestine, shook the trust of the region in the United Nations. At the very same time, a push for the establishment of a, quote, Near East and Middle East Cultural Center, although it had many names, was met with significant resistance in Paris, marking a very short but intense period of negotiations between 1947 and 1949. And this was aimed at increasing representation and support for the Arab states within UNESCO. Nothing was concretized, but much was said and resulted in defining kind of the Muslim-Arab clusters and their agency. It was also during this time that Huxley toured the Middle East in search for regional experts and leaders loyal to the mission of UNESCO. These efforts seem contradictory, but in fact give an indication of the specific ways in which UNESCO sought to engage the Muslim world, largely through the advocacy of the Arab states, and focused on its heritage and historic resources, not necessarily its voices or its experts. This was not the only region or group that felt restrained by the dynamics of the organization. In 1952, the UN General Assembly was warned of an eventual withdrawal from the Organization of Asian and African Nations, who rejected the polarizing and destructive ideology of the Cold War. By April of 1955, in the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, Asian and African states voiced their opposition to colonialism and neocolonialism, propelling the formation of the non-aligned movement against major power blocs. What was clearly an increasingly influential non-European membership called on UNESCO to improve the mutual appreciation between Eastern and Western values. Relevant for the development of heritage policy decades later, an initiative called East-West Major Project concluded that Eastern cultural values were primarily defined by their spiritual, not material riches. Such an assertion justified disconnecting living religious practices and their communities from the archaeological and historical resources that were cherished and acknowledged by the Western-oriented organization. Moreover, it weaponized the misled idea that the East had no capacity to handle their own tangible heritage resources because, apparently they don't care about the tangible heritage resources. So to wrap up and abruptly wrap up the brief history of the establishment of regional intergovernmental organizations and their collaborations with UNESCO, Muslim majority states finally made an impact on the organization in other, more gradual ways after the 1960s, gaining visibility and authority in matters of heritage preservation over the decades, and expertly engaging with UNESCO's global discourse while also growing their own brand of heritage preservation. At the same time, the bolstering of a uniquely Islamic context for preservation, previously ignored in Eurocentric preservation efforts, has been on the rise in the construction of national identities, and interest in the topic of heritage and religion definitely increased for a period of time in the 2000s. And this conference is a solid example of this commitment, although we've missed the hot 10-year period where that's all that UNESCO seemed to do. But the Doha document definitely comes at the time in which this became a topic of interest. Pause. Yes, because I wrote explain the slide. What slide? So when you do, this is a bit of an older search, but when you do a search for Islam, this is the kind of distribution you're getting, and obviously like the heritage sites at risk are generally falling on Muslim countries, so if you overlay this with Muslim majority countries and the whole layout of heritage at risk, you see a massive overlap. But what's really interesting in terms of showing support for the organization is not just like how many countries have been signatories to UNESCO and the convention, but like how much that's increased over time, and how the Arab states, which at the beginning end up being the advocates for this idea of like supporting a Muslim cause or like a Muslim expertise, quickly become outnumbered by other non-Arab states. So the way UNESCO, this is for a different discussion, but the way UNESCO regionalizes the world puts certain conversations pigeonholed into specific areas, right, that eventually are not necessarily representative of the major interest of particular topics, such as like the idea of an Islamic heritage or Islamic Muslim stewardship. Right, unfortunately, efforts at creating an influential heritage sector and global debate attuned to Islam also came at a time when debates about cultural heritage located in the Muslim world became increasingly marred by controversy. So what I'm trying to say is, by the time it becomes interesting to talk about religion, it's also a time when religion is incredibly negative for heritage debates. The Taliban's actions in 2001 were not an isolated crisis featuring the Muslim world. It was followed by the destruction of 15th century shrines in the Malian city of Timbuktu by the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Islamic group Ansar Dineh, and the theatrical erasure of ancient and historic sites by ISIL in both Syria and Iraq starting in 2015. So when religion comes into the main domain of discussions in heritage studies, it does so in the most negative of ways. These incidents were accompanied by countless reports in popular and academic circles on the looting, bombing, erasing, and terrorizing of archaeological sites and museums across the region. As a result of all this, cultural heritage and preservation narratives associated with Islam and the Muslim world in the English literature have for decades oscillated between the fear of iconoclasm and the actions of what is perceived to be uneducated neglect. After all, they were supposed to not care about material heritage. The trope of Islam being intrinsically opposed to or incapable of protecting what many see as universally significant cultural heritage has been especially accentuated in reporting strategies about the region since the first Gulf War. In the face of these structures of representation, I want to provide, and to finish in a better note, one example of the ways in which religious traditions and heritage traditions are negotiated in the 21st century in the state of Qatar. And here I'm actually moving completely away from the topic of destruction and conflict on purpose. What's really interesting about working in Qatar, and I think I mentioned this at some point, is that it doesn't have a lot to say about conflict. So it's a really good place to think about what can we say about the Muslim world and stewardship when it's not about being a victim or a perpetrator, but when it's a place where you're just generating heritage value and you're just generating culture. Qatar's leadership and advocacy since the Doha Declaration of 2001 contradicts many of the representations I just discussed, not simply by proposing a discourse that foregrounds Islamic tradition, teachings, and expertise, but also by testing the authority and relevance of a powerful global culture of heritage preservation that has notoriously been dismissive of the role of living and religious traditions overall. The examination of Qatar as a heritage advocate presents an opportunity for discussing the ways in which a nation negotiates Muslim expertise and interests against the secularizing world of global heritage preservation. Qatar is also exemplary for its rise to the ranks of regional experts and leaders throughout the growth of global and regional heritage traditions, but it was an unlikely candidate. As early as 1968, Indian archaeologist and former Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, Amalananda Ghosh, completed an expert mission to Qatar as the UNESCO consultant to the Arabian Peninsula. His report suggests that Qatar is not a good recruit in the global mission to preserve heritage resources, writing, "I could not find a single mosque which is more than just a few years old. This is perhaps due to the practice of demolishing old mosques to make room for new ones with better amenities." And we see in this notion, reductive notion that Muslim stewardship should only be concerned with mosques, which I think is quite problematic as well. And I put this quote in between to give you an idea of what like the built and historic landscape of Qatar looked like at the time when this consultant comes in to make an assessment of heritage resources. So for those of you who are not familiar with this part of the world, we are talking about like a very rapidly growing nation since the 1940s. And this is the type of layout you're getting for like a few decades. Shortly after gaining independence, Qatar joined UNESCO as a member state in 1972, a typical process of any country gaining independence through the 60s and 70s. Through these early years of informal involvement as a state party, Qatar not only worked towards growing their own infrastructure for heritage and preservation, but also took a position of leadership in regional efforts to support the growth of a heritage preservation sensibility across the Arabian Peninsula. The UNESCO Doha office was set up in 1976 to serve as a cluster office for Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, while an Arab Gulf States Folklore Center was established in 1981 in Doha with a mission to collect, record, study, and disseminate the folklore of the Arab Gulf states as an integral part of the national heritage assemblage of each one of its partners. Qatar's leadership role was dictated by the state's ambition, as much as it was primed by UNESCO itself, who clearly saw in Qatar a strong partner to align the interests of a politically volatile region with those of UNESCO. In the Arabian Peninsula, for example, this partnership has flourished into a growing investment in the UNESCO system of global heritage governance. I love my little graphs. As someone in the humanities, this is all I can do. The ratification of the 1972 Convention, in case people are not in this field again, is a huge commitment. This is not just a signature, it needs to be backed up by significant changes in the legal instrumentation of a country. So this is not just a little political moment, it requires structural realignment of countries in order to align with the UNESCO Convention, right? So that's one thing that's really important. The other thing that's important is to see is you look at the graph, and like after the 1990s, we see a huge rise in nomination to the tentative list, which is a very formal declaration of increased support for the global heritage system. So it shows a commitment by a country to nominate more sites to the World Heritage List. And these are huge commitments. They imply a huge amount of, like, they mobilize a huge amount of expertise, and they are expensive. So this, again, it's not like a light little conversation. These are things whereby things like the ministries of culture then have to realign their priorities in order to present a lot of their domestic product in terms of culture, but also their tourist infrastructure to respond to the need to have more World Heritage sites. And now I lost where I'm okay, in Qatar, of course, this resulted in Qatar hosting and heading the 2014 World Heritage Committee. And now again, they're just doing another term from 21 to 25, which is an incredibly influential position, not just the hosting, but also being part of the inner circle of what's happening in the World Heritage Convention. It is in the context of these international developments that the vision of Qatar for a global tradition of heritage preservation consolidated. At home, the nation embarked on an expansive program to build a heritage industry that serves a growing nation profoundly defined by Islam. These efforts included training a new generation of scholars and experts, as well as intensifying the development, management, and interpretation of cultural heritage and its publics at home. Contributing to a global heritage and investing in a local heritage are efforts really difficult to coordinate when the system itself is asking you to decide whether heritage is secular or religious. And it involves the creation and stimulation of two different cultures of heritage, right? Two different sensibilities and presentations, packaging, marketing of what heritage is. A global secular heritage culture historically obstructive of religious authority, and a local religious heritage culture invested in vernacular traditions that serve and promote an openly religious civil society. The experts involved in these overlaid cultural projects, nonetheless, have often been the same, as are the historic resources and built environments mobilized in support of both heritage industries. So what's really interesting is that the actual heritage landscape is the same when it just gets repackaged. Qatar's interventions disturb these distinctions. In some ways, their actions have seemed to propose an era of openly religious debate in the work of heritage preservation, but not without challenges, and also not actually recognized by any of the typical UNESCO authorities who consider a lot of what a country like Qatar, this is not a unique situation, a lot of what a country like Qatar does in terms of building its heritage infrastructure is often dismissed as being unauthentic, unoriginal, lacking integrity. So the language itself is certainly used to marginalize, well, it's always been used to marginalize post-colonial nations that have newer heritage, but certainly used to marginalize expertise in this case. An example of these tensions lies in the ways in which different bouts of modernization and heritage making in Qatar reconcile its Muslim context. The transformations to the built landscape of Doha from the 1950s to the 1980s represents a first wave of modernization that had practically eradicated traditional architecture and spaces in favor of a modern aesthetic and improvements in infrastructure. This was led by British and North American urbanists and planners, such as LA-based William Pereira, who designed the iconic modernist pyramid for the Sheraton Hotel. In Qatar, modernism was driven by foreign consultants and aligned with global codes of urban planning. Modernism was also a channel through which Qatari culture was made to align with and be consumed by Western global tourism, thrusting Qatar into a sea of interchangeable symbols with little relation to the imagined roots of the nation. To take this point home, a full-page advertisement for the famous Sheraton Pyramid in Fortune magazine in 1993 reads, "Stay at a hotel in Qatar inspired by the pyramids," showing a side-by-side image of William Pereira's Sheraton design and El Castillo, ancient pyramid of Chichen Itza in Mexico. It had not been designed to resemble a pre-Columbian Mayan city, of course. It had been designed by Pereira's team to embody aspects of Islamic architectural design mixed with elements of futurism, and certainly intended to contribute to the idealization of a modern nation built on traditional values and forms. Development of the built environment in this period of expansion and heritage creation displayed some attention to tradition, but a tradition decanted and purified from its religious context. The modernist era in Qatar flourished at a particular window after the demise of 19th century Muslim imperial propaganda and before the rise of modern post-Cold War Islamophobia, as Glass Grinnell argues, when Islam was still largely viewed as a quaint remnant of a traditional way of life that it was assumed would disappear in the ongoing modernization of the world. Accordingly, self-proclaimed chronicler, but just really a tourist of Arabian life, Helga Gran, described a cityscape of Doha in the 1970s where the construction cranes outnumber the mosque towers in the ratio of at least 4-1. Beyond this exaggeration, the project of modernization in Qatar that brought about all the conquests of modern living, such as air conditioning, was also a project of secularization and displacement. This project, experienced in such a sudden and expansive way, was not taken lightly, and now I'm going to tell you one of my quirky case studies. The demolition of the Oryx statue roundabout in 2013, alongside other sculptural art across the cities of the Arabian Peninsula, which have, by all intended purposes, become heritage, resurfaced long-standing tensions in this predominantly Muslim society. Its disappearance prompted a very specific rumor that claimed that South Asian migrant workers had been caught praying to the Oryx due to the animal's likeness to cows, a revered animal in Hinduism. It was an unlikely but sensational story that spread like wildfire, fueled by conflict and tensions between migrants and citizens. The spread of these rumors was not an isolated episode. Years earlier, photographic documentation that surfaced on social media suggests that the pair of oryx were removed temporarily following religious justifications. This time, the concern was the depiction of animal figures, considered by some to be inappropriate in an Islamic city like Doha. Now, this strange example acts as a reminder of the silent tensions that are contained within a heritage fabric and may only resurface once it's disturbed. And if you're wondering why in a heritage conference we're talking about such modern heritage, is because this is the construction of heritage language in a place like Qatar. A lot of what happened in the 70s and 80s is now like quintessential to the heritage language of this country. By the 2000s, the erasure of the modernist city that brought an end to the Oryx roundabout came by the hands of a more recent and possibly more aggressive bout of modernization. So we have two different instances of a complete reconfiguration of the city, which came alongside a complete reconfiguration of what it means to have heritage and tradition. This project aimed to bring back the centrality of tradition and also religion in the heritage identity of Qatar in the exact opposite way that the other project had really done. In doing so, ironically, these transformations ruptured the historical continuity between a traditional pre-industrial and a modern industrial nation, taking with it a lot of pre-1940s architecture that had not been properly protected. But it did present an opportunity to recenter heritage languages on traditional contexts that included a strong nod to Islam, although very rarely this is mentioned. A new heritage language was architected literally in many ways that at times seemed incoherent. Traditional courtyard houses were demolished to make space for modern, sustainable architecture, which would still preserve the features of traditional houses, in particular in attention to practices of privacy in Qatar and like gender divisions within the household. While on the other hand, the redesign of Souq Waqif brought back a homogeneous pre-oil aesthetic that erased the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s from the fabric of this part of the city. So it was returned to the idea that we live like our forefathers used to live. Everywhere else, traditional Islamic patterns became the norm in ultra-modern architecture. And when I was writing the book, I wanted to have a chapter called Mashrabiya Everywhere, because it's everywhere now. And it's great. There's a whole other side conversation about sustainability and cooling that's really interesting to bring to the table now, but we can talk about that over coffee. What the erasure of modernism provided in Qatar was an opportunity to return to a different version of traditional fabric and architectural language, which is a very intentional construction of heritage. Populated by new visual statements that pay homage to Islamic art, urban interventions that engage with traditional knowledge and uses of space, and regeneration projects that combine and integrate traditional uses, modern materials, and design. And whenever you read traditional uses, traditional spaces, it actually does mean Muslim-oriented, Muslim-friendly, okay? It's just often not right about it. Urban projects in New Millennium cement these legacies to reconcile old and new imaginations of a city slated to represent traditional and Muslim lifestyles and culture, the specters of an Islamic city in new sustainable ways. The strongest of these examples of these efforts is the development and use of new heritage languages in the Mishered Downtown Doha project. And if you've watched the World Cup coverage, you see a lot of that featured as like a really big presentation card for Doha and Qatar. This development project consolidates a coherent heritage and architectural language that proposes community living, traditional Qatari heritage and aesthetics, and modern technology that celebrates and encourages harmony with the environment, bringing people back to their roots, while simultaneously recreating said roots within the context of modern comfort and luxuries. And these are words I grabbed from everything that has been written on the project by the project, and it's, again, I want to say how fascinating it is, how much effort they put into avoiding saying Islam in all of this documentation. Oh, and just another example of this. So one of the things they did was to return a lot of the uses of space from a traditional Islamic city, so adding sikas, and also sustainably orienting a lot of these streets with particular cooling waves of the Arabian Gulf, so that it's all passive cooling, and also the notion of spending time outdoors by creating protected, shaded areas that are inspired by the most basic of traditional lifestyles, get out of the sun when it's sunny, except that that open space has air conditioning in the floor at all times, which is very interesting. Please go to that space in Mishered when you go to Doha. Tim Makover, then a principal architect in Allies and Morrison, with an interest in heritage architecture, proposed to orchestrate this project by following what he called the 7 steps. 1, to ensure continuity between the past, the present, and the future through finding timeless motifs and techniques and using them in new ways that represent time-honored traditions. 2, to achieve harmony and cohesion in the city by promoting diversity bound together by a common language, and then there's a whole other bunch of steps. 7, to build on Qatari architectural tradition by using a new language, rich in reference and strong in resonance, flexible, to be spoken in many accents but consistent, to be understood by all. So again, Islam or Muslim are rarely articulated directly in these modern discourses. It's a concept embedded and packaged in tradition. This architectural language is eerily similar to that proposed by Pereira in the 1970s in an early bout of modernization, the one that actually sort of erased religion from the fabric of the city. And it claimed to foreground Islamic values in the region. His project in Yambo, Saudi Arabia, and I could not find a single photo of this project, foregrounded Islam much more explicitly than his work in Doha. He called Yambo a city of the future, designed to be modern, yet accommodating traditional Islamic architectures. It mentions Islam, it talks about Arabian customs, it talks about privacy. Some of these keywords are very familiar in the way people think about traditional heritage and lifestyles, but they seem to be really coded in a place like Qatar. This type of architectural and heritage language in practice is evident in the Friday Mosque of Mishered, designed by John McCaslin and Partners, a London-based firm. And in their own words, this is arguably the most precisely ordered fusion of Islamic and modernist architecture in Mishered. The mosque's rectilineal plan, cuboid volumes, and restrained by elegant elevational modeling, recall the pure lines of Joseph Hoffman's pre-1918 architecture, intensifying the atmospheres created by the Islamic arrangement of thresholds, as well as the beautifully complex geometric patterning of surfaces, screens, and flows of light within the interior volumes. So this is the way in which the new heritage language gets more easily recreated by calling attention to all of these aesthetic and more kind of art historical and architectural features. So my point here, and close to closing, is that resurfacing of Islam in traditional design has been done primarily by the hands of global advocates and experts that respond to the requests of the nation state. And there are 2 conclusions I want to draw from this example to help us think about the challenges for heritage and the Muslim world in the 21st century, how it's studied, how we write about it, and how we think about it. One is that to support and promote global heritage values in the way in which Qatar has expertly done, but also in the way in which nobody has really managed to really do within the global sphere, is also to support a certain sidelining of particular elements of religious tradition, in particular the voices and forms of authorities, forms of interpretation, and decision-making. 2 is that the heritage landscape of Qatar demonstrates the ways in which a Muslim nation navigates a loaded global heritage playing field. The languages and forms of expertise that rule the global heritage sphere have significant influence over the local heritage sphere. This is why you just heard of all these foreign experts defining and designing what an Islamic heritage is, what an Islamic city is, and what it should be. Still, Qatar mobilizes its global force strategically in order to observe its different national visions, right? Like the first part of modernization, operating in one direction, and the second one operating in the other. So to close, the turn of the millennium marked a growing interest in the spheres of religion for the study and management of heritage resources, and it looked like there was going to be a huge opportunity to recreate the field around this interest. And it also marked a rejection of the globalizing orientations of heritage in order to focus on locality and indigeneity. So all that is good. However, these invitations to decolonize came at a time when discourses and epistemologies were already sealed and significantly oriented around secularizing traditions. So it's sometimes heritage as a lens and preservation as a lens. It's actually not that useful for reinventing how people relate to their landscape, which is the most interesting aspect of thinking about heritage. For this, it's critical to closely examine the disassembling and reassembling processes of heritage preservation traditions in the Muslim world, and definitely staying away from timelines, because that's what global heritage discourse does. It just creates like unified timelines. And as an interplay of global and local stewardship efforts, and certainly with a deep historicization of the processes that took place within and outside of whatever countries we're working in order to really reveal the way these forces are operating at a soft diplomatic level, at a political level, and at a social level. Thank you.